The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Belvedere Ballroom didn't just illuminate the room, they exposed every flaw, every tremor and every whispered scandal of the elite. But tonight the opulence felt like a shroud. The air was thick, not with the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume, but with a paralyzing, suffocating dread. At the center of the hall sat a circular table draped in damask silk, an island of isolation in a sea of crowded opulence. No one dared to sit within 20 feet of it. The guests huddled at the periphery, their laughter forced, their eyes darting nervously toward the man who sat there alone. He was the storm in the center of the calm. Dominic Toretto Corleone, the Duke of Blackwood, sat with a posture so rigid it bordered on lethal. To the high society of this city, he wasn't just a nobleman. He was a predator who had forgotten how to hunt because the prey simply laid down and died at his feet. His reputation for a cold, serrated temper was legendary. They called him the Iron Duke, a man whose silence could strip the paint off the walls and whose gaze could make a grown man's heart skip a beat, not out of affection but out of the sheer, primal instinct to survive. The staff moved like ghosts. They hovered near the kitchen doors, passing silver trays with trembling fingers, counting the seconds until they could retreat into the safety of the shadows. To approach the Duke was to walk into a firing squad. One wrong clink of a spoon, one drop of wine spilled on that pristine tablecloth and a career, or a life, could be dismantled before the dessert course. "Don't look at him," the head steward whispered to the staff, his voice cracking. "Drop the plate, pivot and vanish. Do not make eye contact. Do not speak unless he demands it. And God help you, do not linger." But in the back of the kitchen, tightening the strings of her starched white apron, Elsa Skywalker wasn't listening to the warnings. She was looking through the service window, her brow furrowed not with fear, but with a strange, aching pull of curiosity. She saw the most powerful man in the room, and all she saw was a man who looked like he was starving in the middle of a feast, not for food, but for a single soul who wasn't terrified of his shadow. While the rest of the world saw a monster, Elsa saw a void. And she was about to do the one thing that was strictly forbidden in the Blackwood Protocol. She was about to treat the monster like a human being. Before we dive into the moment that changed the history of the Blackwood estate forever, I want to say a huge hello to all of you joining us today. We are so glad you're here to witness this journey of courage and hidden hearts. Whether you're watching from the bustling streets of New York, the quiet highlands of Scotland, or the sunny coasts of Australia, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? We love hearing from our global family. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep bringing these intense, emotional stories to life. Are you ready to see what happens when a lion meets a woman who refuses to blink? Let's continue. Elsa took a deep breath, the scent of lavender soap on her skin clashing with the heavy musk of the ballroom. She picked up the heavy silver carafe of ice water. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands, the hands of a girl who had survived much worse than a duke's scowl, were steady as a rock. She stepped out from behind the velvet curtain. The room went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. 100 pairs of eyes followed her as she bypassed the safe tables, walking straight toward the center of the room. She wasn't scurrying. She wasn't bowing her head. She walked with the quiet, rhythmic grace of someone who knew her worth. Dominic didn't look up. He was staring at the wine in his glass as if it were a map of a battlefield. He felt the shift in the room, the sudden drop in temperature that usually accompanied someone's terror. He expected the frantic, hurried shadow of a servant. Instead he felt a presence. Soft, warm, unfazed. Elsa reached the table. She didn't drop the water and run. She stood there, just inches from the man who could end her livelihood with a snap of his fingers. She leaned in, the heat of her breath catching the stray hairs at the nape of his neck, and she did the unthinkable. She didn't wait for him to speak. She didn't tremble. "You look like a man who's tired of drinking alone," she said, her voice a low melodic hum that sliced through the silence of the ballroom like a warm knife through ice. Dominic's hand froze on his glass. The entire room held its collective breath. The head steward turned pale, certain he was about to witness a massacre. Slowly, with the deliberate lethargy of a ticking time bomb, the Duke turned his head. His eyes, a piercing, stormy gray, locked onto hers. He expected to see a girl pleading for her life. Instead he saw Elsa Skywalker. She was smiling, a small, genuine and utterly fearless smile. "Is that so?" Dominic rasped, his voice like grinding stones. And who gave you permission to have an opinion on my mood, waitress? Elsa didn't flinch. She poured the water into his glass, the sound crisp and clear in the deadened room. No one, she replied simply. But then again, no one ever asks the lonely if they'd like a little company, do they? They're all too busy being afraid of the silence. For the first time in 10 years, the Duke of Blackwood didn't feel the urge to roar. He felt a spark, a sharp, dangerous jolt of intrigue that bypassed his defenses and struck somewhere deep in his chest. Who was this woman? And did she have any idea that by breaking the rule of the table, she had just placed a target on her heart that he might never let go of? The silence that followed Elsa's remark was so absolute it felt like the ballroom had been plunged underwater. Dominic Toretto Corleone didn't blink. He studied her, his gaze tracking the steady rise and fall of her chest, searching for the telltale twitch of a muscle or the dilation of a pupil that would betray her terror. He found none. Elsa stood her ground, the silver carafe held loosely at her side, her expression one of mild, patient expectation, as if she were waiting for a stubborn child to finish a tantrum rather than a duke to deliver a death sentence. "The silence is a shield, girl," Dominic finally said, his voice dropping to a predatory silkiness that made the nearby guests shudder. "People who speak into it usually find themselves swallowed whole." "Then it's a good thing I've always been a strong swimmer," Elsa countered, her eyes sparkling with a hint of defiance that shouldn't have been there. She gave a polite, measured nod, not a subservient bow but a gesture of mutual recognition, and turned to move toward the next table. Dominic watched her retreat, his dinner forgotten. For the first time in years, the suffocating boredom of his existence had been punctured. Elsa retreated to the kitchen, her heart finally beginning to thrum a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't a fool, she knew she was playing with fire. But Elsa Skywalker had been raised in the shadow of the Himalayan mountains Gump, where the wind bit harder than any nobleman's words and the only way to survive was to look the storm in the eye. Her father, a disgraced scholar who had taught her that dignity was the only currency no one could steal, had died leaving her with nothing but a mountain of debt and a sharp, inquisitive mind. She took this job at the Grand Belvedere not because she aspired to serve the rich, but because it was the only place that paid enough to keep the roof over her younger sister's head. Bella Swan Everdeen was only 10, a fragile girl with eyes too big for her face and a cough that lingered in the damp city air. Every penny Elsa earned was a brick in the wall she was building to protect Bella from the harshness of the world. "Are you insane?" The whisper came from Atticus Finchlebowski, the head waiter. He was a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of being invisible. He grabbed Elsa's arm, his eyes wide with genuine panic. "You spoke to him. You challenged him. Do you have any idea who that is? That's the man who broke the steel union in the north without losing a night's sleep. They say he keeps the hearts of his enemies in a jar on his desk." Elsa gently pried his hand off her sleeve. "He's a man, Atticus. He eats, he breathes, and by the looks of it he's miserable. If he wants to fire me for offering him water, then he wasn't worth working for anyway." "It's not just about being fired, Elsa," Atticus hissed. "The Blackwoods don't just fire people. They erase them. Get back to the appetizer station and don't go near that table again. I'll send Inigo Montoya Vader to finish the service. He's too old for the Duke to bother killing." But Elsa couldn't shake the image of the Duke's eyes. They hadn't been cold, not exactly. They had been hollow. Like a house that had been grand once before the fires went out. Back in the ballroom, Dominic wasn't listening to the sycophants trying to catch his ear from the safety of the neighboring tables. He was focused on the kitchen door. He beckoned his personal aide, a sharp-featured man named Sherlock Holmes Bond, who appeared instantly at his shoulder. "The waitress," Dominic murmured, not taking his eyes off the velvet curtains. "The one with the mountain air in her lungs. I want to know everything. Where she sleeps, who she loves, and why she thinks she is immune to fear." "Of course, Your Grace," Sherlock replied, his voice a neutral chime. "Shall I have her removed?" Dominic felt a strange, sharp pang of something that felt dangerously like hunger, but not for food. "No," he said, a slow, dark smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I want her to serve my private chambers tomorrow morning. I want to see if that quiet confidence holds up when there isn't a room full of witnesses to protect her." Elsa didn't know the trap was being set. She spent the rest of the night moving through the crowd, a blur of white linen and focused grace. She felt the weight of the Duke's gaze on her back like a physical brand. It was heavy, hot, and strangely grounding. Most men looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture or a fleeting distraction. Dominic looked at her as if she were a riddle he intended to solve, no matter how many pieces he had to break in the process. As the clock struck midnight and the elite began to filter out into their waiting carriages, Elsa stepped out into the cool night air for a moment of peace. The city of Oakhaven breathed below her, a sprawling hive of ambition and cruelty. She pulled a crumpled photograph from her pocket. Bella, smiling in the sun. Just a few more months, Elsa thought. Just enough to get us to the coast where the air is clean. A beautiful sentiment. A voice rumbled from the shadows. Elsa didn't scream. She didn't even jump. She simply turned, tucking the photo away. Dominic stood there, his long black overcoat making him look like a part of the night itself. The orange glow of his cigar was the only light in the dim alleyway. "You're late for your carriage, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. "I don't keep schedules," he replied, stepping into the light. "I keep interests. And you, Elsa Skywalker, are the first thing that has interested me in a decade." He took a step closer, invading her personal space, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain-damp cedar wrapping around her. He reached out, his gloved finger hovering just an inch from her jawline. He didn't touch her, but the heat was unmistakable. "Tell me," he whispered, "are you truly brave? Or are you just very, very good at pretending?" Elsa looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "In my experience, Your Grace, there isn't much difference between the two." Dominic let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, a sound that hadn't escaped his throat in years. "We shall see. You start in the East Wing tomorrow at dawn. Don't be late. I find tardiness even more offensive than insolence." He turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving Elsa alone with the sound of her own racing heart. She realized then that she hadn't just broken a rule, she had stepped into a different world entirely. A world where the Duke of Blackwood was the sun, and she was suddenly caught in his gravity. Before we move on to the moment their lives truly collide, I have to ask, have you ever taken a risk that changed everything? We want to hear your brave moment stories in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this clash of wills, make sure you've liked the video. It helps us more than you know. The East Wing of the Blackwood estate didn't just house a man. It housed a myth. The corridors were lined with tapestries that seemed to bleed history, and the air carried the scent of ancient leather and cold stone. Elsa Skywalker arrived at dawn, her boots clicking softly against the marble. She carried a silver tray with a porcelain tea set, her breath hitching as she reached the towering mahogany doors. This wasn't a ballroom full of witnesses. This was his sanctuary. She didn't knock. The instructions from Sherlock Holmes' Bond had been clear. Enter, serve, and do not speak unless spoken to. She pushed the doors open. The room was a vast library, books climbing toward a ceiling painted with celestial maps. Dominic was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, silhouetted against the pale gray morning. He didn't turn. He looked like a statue carved from shadows. "Set it on the low table," he commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. Elsa moved with purposeful silence. She set the tray down, the porcelain clinking with a delicate musical ring. She didn't leave. Instead, she adjusted the layout of the tray, moving the honey closer to the tea, placing a small sprig of mint she'd plucked from the garden on the saucer. "You're lingering again, Elsa Skywalker," Dominic said, finally turning. His eyes were bloodshot, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the sharp, lethal lines of his collarbones. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a century. "Is the view of my misery that entertaining?" "It's not misery, Your Grace," Elsa replied, her voice steady. "It's exhaustion. You're fighting a war that ended years ago." Dominic's eyes flashed, a sudden violent spark of amber in the gray. He crossed the room in 3 long predatory strides, stopping so close she could feel the radiating heat of his anger. He towered over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You know nothing of my wars. You are a girl who carries trays and polishes silver. Do not mistake my curiosity for an invitation to psychoanalyze me." He reached out, his hand gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Why aren't you shaking? Every woman who has stood in this spot has either trembled or tried to seduce me. You do neither. Why?" Elsa looked up, her gaze locking onto his with a searing intensity. Because a tray is just a tray and a duke is just a man. She took this job at the Grand Belvedere not because she aspired to serve the rich, but because it was the only place that paid enough to keep the roof over her younger sister's head. Bella Swan Everdeen was only 10, a fragile girl with eyes too big for her face and a cough that lingered in the damp city air. Every penny Elsa earned was a brick in the wall she was building to protect Bella from the harshness of the world. "Are you insane?" The whisper came from Atticus Finch-Lebowski, the head waiter. He was a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of being invisible. He grabbed Elsa's arm, his eyes wide with genuine panic. "You spoke to him. You challenged him. Do you have any idea who that is? That's the man who broke the steel union in the north without losing a night's sleep. They say he keeps the hearts of his enemies in a jar on his desk." Elsa gently pried his hand off her sleeve. "He's a man, Atticus. He eats, he breathes, and by the looks of it, he's miserable. If he wants to fire me for offering him water, then he wasn't worth working for anyway." "It's not just about being fired, Elsa," Atticus hissed. "The Blackwoods don't just fire people. They erase them. Get back to the appetizer station and don't go near that table again. I'll send Inigo Montoya Vader to finish the service. He's too old for the Duke to bother killing." But Elsa couldn't shake the image of the Duke's eyes. They hadn't been cold, not exactly. They had been hollow. Like a house that had been grand once before the fires went out. Back in the ballroom, Dominic wasn't listening to the sycophants trying to catch his ear from the safety of the neighboring tables. He was focused on the kitchen door. He beckoned his personal aide, a sharp-featured man named Sherlock Holmes Bond, who appeared instantly at his shoulder. "The waitress," Dominic murmured, not taking his eyes off the velvet curtains. "The one with the mountain air in her lungs. I want to know everything. Where she sleeps, who she loves, and why she thinks she is immune to fear." "Of course, Your Grace," Sherlock replied, his voice a neutral chime. "Shall I have her removed?" Dominic felt a strange, sharp pang of something that felt dangerously like hunger, but not for food. "No," he said, a slow, dark smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I want her to serve my private chambers tomorrow morning. I want to see if that quiet confidence holds up when there isn't a room full of witnesses to protect her." Elsa didn't know the trap was being set. She spent the rest of the night moving through the crowd, a blur of white linen and focused grace. She felt the weight of the Duke's gaze on her back like a physical brand. It was heavy, hot, and strangely grounding. Most men looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture or a fleeting distraction. Dominic looked at her as if she were a riddle he intended to solve, no matter how many pieces he had to break in the process. As the clock struck midnight and the elite began to filter out into their waiting carriages, Elsa stepped out into the cool night air for a moment of peace. The city of Oakhaven breathed below her, a sprawling hive of ambition and cruelty. She pulled a crumpled photograph from her pocket. Bella, smiling in the sun. "Just a few more months," Elsa thought. "Just enough to get us to the coast where the air is clean." A beautiful sentiment. A voice rumbled from the shadows. Elsa didn't scream. She didn't even jump. She simply turned, tucking the photo away. Dominic stood there, his long black overcoat making him look like a part of the night itself. The orange glow of his cigar was the only light in the dim alleyway. "You're late for your carriage, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. "I don't keep schedules," he replied, stepping into the light. "I keep interests. And you, Elsa Skywalker, are the first thing that has interested me in a decade." He took a step closer, invading her personal space, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain-damp cedar wrapping around her. He reached out, his gloved finger hovering just an inch from her jawline. He didn't touch her, but the heat was unmistakable. "Tell me," he whispered, "are you truly brave? Or are you just very, very good at pretending?" Elsa looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "In my experience, Your Grace, there isn't much difference between the two." Dominic let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, a sound that hadn't escaped his throat in years. "We shall see. You start in the East Wing tomorrow at dawn. Don't be late. I find tardiness even more offensive than insolence." He turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving Elsa alone with the sound of her own racing heart. She realized then that she hadn't just broken a rule, she had stepped into a different world entirely. A world where the Duke of Blackwood was the sun, and she was suddenly caught in his gravity. Before we move on to the moment their lives truly collide, I have to ask, have you ever taken a risk that changed everything? We want to hear your brave moment stories in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this clash of wills, make sure you've liked the video. It helps us more than you know. The east wing of the Blackwood estate didn't just house a man. It housed a myth. The corridors were lined with tapestries that seemed to bleed history, and the air carried the scent of ancient leather and cold stone. Elsa Skywalker arrived at dawn, her boots clicking softly against the marble. She carried a silver tray with a porcelain tea set, her breath hitching as she reached the towering mahogany doors. This wasn't a ballroom full of witnesses. This was his sanctuary. She didn't knock. The instructions from Sherlock Holmes' Bond had been clear. Enter, serve, and do not speak unless spoken to. She pushed the doors open. The room was a vast library, books climbing toward a ceiling painted with celestial maps. Dominic was standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, silhouetted against the pale gray morning. He didn't turn. He looked like a statue carved from shadows. "Set it on the low table," he commanded, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. Elsa moved with purposeful silence. She set the tray down, the porcelain clinking with a delicate musical ring. She didn't leave. Instead, she adjusted the layout of the tray, moving the honey closer to the tea, placing a small sprig of mint she'd plucked from the garden on the saucer. "You're lingering again, Elsa Skywalker," Dominic said, finally turning. His eyes were bloodshot, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the sharp, lethal lines of his collarbones. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a century. "Is the view of my misery that entertaining?" "It's not misery, Your Grace," Elsa replied, her voice steady. "It's exhaustion. You're fighting a war that ended years ago." Dominic's eyes flashed, a sudden violent spark of amber in the gray. He crossed the room in 3 long predatory strides, stopping so close she could feel the radiating heat of his anger. He towered over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You know nothing of my wars. You are a girl who carries trays and polishes silver. Do not mistake my curiosity for an invitation to psychoanalyze me." He reached out, his hand gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "Why aren't you shaking? Every woman who has stood in this spot has either trembled or tried to seduce me. You do neither." "Why?" Elsa looked up, her gaze locking onto his with a searing intensity. "Because a tray is just a tray and a duke is just a man. And because I have a sister at home who needs me to be brave. Fear is a luxury I can't afford." Dominic opened his mouth to deliver a scathing retort, but the words died in his throat. He saw the fire in her, the raw, unyielding survival instinct that matched his own. For a heartbeat, the air between them crackled with an energy that wasn't anger. It was a recognition. A collision of 2 souls who had both been forged in fire. But the moment was shattered by a frantic pounding on the library doors. Sherlock Holmes' Bond burst in, his usual composure shattered. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion, but there is a situation. The Blackwood vaults in the lower city, they've been breached." Dominic's entire demeanor shifted. The intrigued man vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless leader. "Breached? By whom?" "The syndicate of the Vito Corleone Sparrow," Sherlock hissed. "They didn't take gold, sir. They took the ledger of blood." Dominic turned pale, a rare sight. The ledger contained the names of every informant, every hidden asset, and every soul the Blackwoods protected. If that book fell into the wrong hands, Oakhaven would burn and thousands would die. "Find them," Dominic roared. "Seal the city. I want their heads on the gates by sundown." As Sherlock rushed out, Dominic turned back to Elsa. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Go back to the kitchen, Elsa. The games are over. This city is about to become a graveyard." But as he reached for his jacket, he stumbled. A sharp, guttural cough tore from his lungs, and he pressed a white linen handkerchief to his mouth. When he pulled it away, it was stained with bright arterial red. Elsa didn't run. She didn't scream. She stepped forward and caught his arm before he could fall. "You're sick," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "The unpredictable temper. The isolation. You aren't hiding because you hate people. You're hiding because you're dying." Dominic shoved her away, but his strength was gone. He slumped into his chair, his breathing ragged. "It's a curse, not a sickness," he spat. And if the syndicate finds out the Duke is weak, they won't just take the ledger. They'll take everything. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of desperation and command. You saw nothing, Elsa Skywalker. If a word of this leaves this room, I will ensure you and your sister vanish before the sun sets. Elsa looked at the blood on the handkerchief, then at the man who was trying to threaten her while his own body betrayed him. A wild, dangerous idea took root in her mind. The syndicate expects a monster, Elsa said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. They expect the Iron Duke to come charging out of his gates. But you can't even stand. If you go out there like this, you're a dead man walking. And what do you suggest, Waitress? He sneered. That I send you? Yes, Elsa said. The syndicate doesn't know me. I'm invisible. I'm just a servant. I can get into the lower city docks where no noble can go. I can find where they've taken the ledger while you stay here and maintain the illusion of power. Dominic stared at her as if she had grown wings. You'd risk your life for a man who just threatened your sister? Why? Because, Elsa said, her heart hammering a rhythm of pure adrenaline, I think there's something in that ledger worth saving. And because I'm tired of watching people die because they're too proud to ask for help. The Duke of Blackwood looked at the tiny, fierce woman standing before him. He saw the impossibility of her offer and the absolute necessity of it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy signet ring, a black diamond etched with a wolf's head. Take this, he whispered, pressing the cold metal into her palm. If you find the ledger, show this to the man at the Broken Anchor Tavern. His name is Jack Sparrow McFly. He'll help you. But Elsa. He gripped her hand, his fingers like ice. If you are caught, I cannot save you. I will deny I ever knew your name. I know, Elsa said, closing her hand around the ring. The inciting incident was complete. The waitress and the Duke were no longer master and servant. They were conspirators in a game where the stakes were nothing less than the soul of the city. The transition from the velvet-lined halls of the East Wing to the sulfur-choked alleys of the Oakhaven docks was like stepping into a different dimension. Elsa Skywalker pulled her dark cloak tighter around her shoulders, the heavy weight of the Duke's signet ring pressed against her palm inside her pocket. The air here didn't smell of lavender. It smelled of salt, rot, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Following the Duke's instructions, Elsa navigated the labyrinth of the lower city. She was no longer a waitress, she was a shadow. She moved past the huddled groups of sailors and the sharp-eyed lookouts of the syndicate. To them, she was just another girl of the streets, invisible and unimportant. She found the Broken Anchor tucked between two leaning warehouses. Inside, the air was a thick soup of pipe smoke and cheap ale. She spotted him at a corner table, Jack Sparrow McFly. He looked less like a noble's asset and more like a man who had been shipwrecked in a tavern. She sat across from him without an invitation. Before he could protest, she slid the black diamond ring across the scarred wood. Jack's eyes widened, his hand darting out to cover the ring like a startled crow. He leaned in, his breath smelling of rum and peppermint. Do you have any idea what you're carrying, girl? This ring doesn't just open doors, it starts wars. I'm not here for a history lesson, Jack, Elsa whispered, her voice cutting through the tavern's roar. The Ledger of Blood. Where is it? Jack's gaze darted toward the back of the room. The syndicate isn't just holding it. They're selling it. Tonight. At the midnight auction in the Iron Foundry. If it goes to the highest bidder, the Duke's empire becomes a buffet for every vulture in the kingdom. Then we're going to the auction, Elsa said. We. Jack let out a dry, hacking laugh. You're a waitress with a stolen ring. I'm a man who values his skin. There's no we. Then give me the location and I'll go alone, Elsa countered, her eyes burning with a fire that made Jack flinch. But if I don't come back, the Duke will know exactly who let his messenger walk into a trap. Jack groaned, rubbing his face. Fine. But we need a disguise. You can't walk into the foundry looking like a servant. While Elsa navigated the dangers of the docks, back at the estate, Dominic Toretto Corleone was fighting a different kind of battle. He sat in his darkened study, the lights dimmed to hide the pallor of his skin. Every breath was a struggle, a reminder of the ticking clock in his chest. Your Grace, Sherlock Holmes Bond whispered, entering the room. The Council of Lords is demanding an audience. They've heard rumors of the breach. They want to see the Iron Duke. They want proof that you are still capable. Dominic gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Tell them I am occupied with state matters. Tell them the first man who crosses my threshold without an invitation will find his assets frozen and his title stripped. They won't be held off for long, sir, Sherlock warned. And there's more. A package arrived. For the waitress. He set a small wooden box on the desk. Dominic opened it. Inside was a single wilted mountain flower from the Himalayas, and a note in a shaky child's hand. For Elsa. Come home soon. I'm practicing my reading. Love, Bella. Dominic felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest. It wasn't the sickness. It was guilt. He had sent a woman with a sister, a woman with a life, into the heart of a serpent's nest. He looked at the flower, then at his own trembling hand. Sherlock, Dominic rasped. Prepare the carriage. And find my old officer's coat. The one that hides the tremors. Sir, you aren't fit to leave this room, Sherlock protested. I am the Duke of Blackwood, Dominic growled, standing up with a monumental effort that left him dizzy. And I will not sit here while a girl does my fighting for me. Back at the iron foundry, the tension was reaching a boiling point. Elsa, now dressed in a borrowed silk gown that felt like a suit of armor, stood in the shadows of the gallery. Jack Sparrow McFly hovered behind her, his hand on a concealed dagger. Below them, the auction was in full swing. Men in expensive masks bid on secrets, lives and territories. At the center of the floor, held in a birdcage of reinforced steel, sat the ledger of blood. There it is, Elsa whispered. But as she moved to get a closer look, a heavy hand dropped onto her shoulder. She turned to find herself staring into the cold, calculating eyes of the syndicate's enforcer, Loki Odinson Vader. You have a very familiar face, my lady, Loki purred, his grip tightening. But your scent, it doesn't smell like perfume. It smells like the kitchen of the Grand Belvedere. Elsa's heart plummeted. The red herring Jack had planted, a false rumor that she was a rogue duchess, had failed. I think, Loki continued, leaning in close, that the Duke is more desperate than we thought if he's sending his serving staff to do a man's job. Let's see what else you're hiding. Before Jack could intervene, a booming voice echoed through the foundry, vibrating the very metal of the floor. Release her. The crowd parted. Standing at the entrance, silhouetted by the orange glow of the furnaces, was Dominic. He looked terrifying. He was draped in black, his eyes burning with a cold, unnatural light. He walked with a cane, but he didn't look weak. He looked like a god of war who had simply decided to use a staff. The Duke, someone hissed. Dominic didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at Elsa. For a second, the danger of the foundry vanished. There was only the two of them, the dying king and the waitress who had seen his soul. She is mine, Dominic said, his voice a low thunder. And if you touch so much as a hair on her head, I will burn this city to the ground just to see your ashes. The tension in the room was a physical weight. The syndicate members drew their weapons. The Duke's hidden guards shifted in the shadows. One spark, one wrong move, and the foundry would become a slaughterhouse. Before the first blade could swing, I have to ask, who do you think is the real threat here? The Duke's temper or the syndicate's greed? Let us know your theories in the comments. And if you're gripping your seat, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the climax of this showdown. The iron foundry felt like the mouth of a volcano. Steam hissed from overhead pipes, and the rhythmic thump-thump of the heavy machinery mimicked the frantic beating of Elsa's heart. Dominic stood at the center of the floor, his black cane clicking against the metal grating with the finality of a judge's gavel. Loki Odinson Vader let out a low, oily chuckle, his grip on Elsa's shoulder tightening until she winced. The Duke himself. I heard you were bedridden, Your Grace. I heard the Iron Duke had turned to rust. Rumors are the currency of the weak, Loki, Dominic rasped. He didn't look sick. He looked like a man who had transcended pain through sheer, concentrated spite. Release the girl. Now. Loki pulled Elsa back, using her as a human shield. And why would I do that? She's the most interesting thing to come out of your estate in years. She carries your signet, she speaks your name without trembling. Tell me, does she know what's actually in the ledger she's so desperate to save? Dominic's expression didn't change, but Elsa felt a sudden icy shift in the air. The ledger is a record of state assets, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave. Is it? Loki laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. He reached into the birdcage and snatched the heavy leather-bound book. He flipped it open to a marked page. Then why is the first name in the collateral section Bella Swan Everdeen? The world stopped spinning. Elsa felt the blood drain from her face, her knees buckling. Bella. What? Elsa whispered, her voice cracking. Loki's eyes danced with malicious glee. Oh, she doesn't know. The kind Duke didn't tell her. This isn't a list of informants, little waitress. This is a list of leverage. Every person in Oakhaven who owes the Blackwood estate a debt they can't pay, their children, their siblings, they are listed here as property. Your sister's medical bills? The ones the charitable Duke paid for anonymously? They weren't a gift. They were a purchase. Elsa turned her head, her gaze burning into Dominic's. Is it true? Dominic didn't look away. The mask of the Iron Duke finally cracked, revealing a raw, jagged grief that was harder to look at than his anger. Elsa. Is true? She screamed, the sound echoing off the iron rafters. The system was in place long before I took the title. Dominic roared, his voice breaking into a wet, painful cough. I didn't start the ledger, Elsa. I've been trying to. You lied to me. Elsa shoved Loki's hand off her shoulder, the shock of the betrayal giving her a sudden violent strength. She stepped toward Dominic, her finger trembling as she pointed at the book. I thought you were a man worth saving. I thought you were lonely and misunderstood. But you're just a collector. You didn't see a brave woman. You saw a debt you hadn't collected yet. The midpoint revelation had shattered everything. The romantic tension that had been building between them, the shared glances, the recognition of two kindred spirits, was suddenly poisoned. I am the Duke of Blackwood, Dominic said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. I do what is necessary to keep this city from tearing itself apart. Then you can keep your city, Elsa spat, tears finally blurring her vision. And you can keep your ledger. Because if my sister is just a line item to you, then you are exactly the monster they say you are. In the chaos of the revelation, Loki saw his opening. He didn't want the ledger anymore, he wanted the Duke's head. He whistled, and a dozen syndicate shadows dropped from the rafters, blades gleaming in the orange firelight. Kill the Duke. Loki commanded. The girl is irrelevant now. But Elsa wasn't irrelevant. As the first assassin lunged at a weakened, coughing Dominic, Elsa didn't run for the exit. Despite the betrayal, despite the crushing weight of the lie, her instincts took over. She grabbed a heavy iron rod from a nearby rack and swung it with the desperation of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The rod connected with the assassin's ribs with a sickening crack. Jack. Now, she screamed. Jack Sparrow McFly, who had been waiting for the signal, kicked over a vat of cooling oil. The floor became a skating rink of fire and slick darkness. Elsa, get out of here. Dominic shouted, parrying a blade with his cane. Save yourself. I'm not doing this for you. Elsa yelled back, ducking under a swing. I'm doing it for the names in that book. And when this is over, you and I are going to have a very different conversation about what collateral means. The room exploded into a symphony of violence and heat. But even as she fought, Elsa felt a hollow ache in her chest that no physical wound could match. She had seen the Duke's heart and she had thought it was gold. Now she knew it was just iron, cold, hard, and unyielding. Before we move into the darkest hour of our story, I want to know, can a betrayal this deep ever be forgiven? Is Dominic a villain who can be redeemed, or has he gone too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading every single one. And if you're as heartbroken as I am for Elsa, make sure you've subscribed to see how she survives this. The fire in the iron foundry was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical wall of heat that roared toward the ceiling. But for Elsa Skywalker, the world had gone ice cold. She swung the iron rod with a mechanical, numbing precision, each strike a release of the agony blooming in her chest. She had trusted a wolf to guard the sheep, and the wolf had been counting the flock for slaughter all along. Elsa, look out! The shout came from Jack Sparrow McFly, but it was too late. A heavy blow from a syndicate cudgel caught Elsa across the temple. The world tilted, the orange flames blurring into a sickening smear of light. She collapsed to the cold metal grating, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Through the haze she saw Dominic. He was fighting like a man possessed, his cane snapping out with lethal accuracy, but his movements were slowing. His face was a mask of gray exhaustion, a thin trail of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He wasn't just fighting the syndicate, he was fighting his own failing heart. Take her! Loki Odinson roared, pointing his blade at Elsa's slumped form. If the Duke won't surrender the ledger, we'll see how much he values his favorite collateral. Two men lunged for her. Dominic let out a primal, ragged scream of fury. He threw his cane aside, drawing a concealed silver pistol from his coat, but as he leveled it, a sudden violent spasm of coughing racked his frame. He fell to one knee, the gun clattering to the floor. No! Elsa tried to scream, but her voice was a raspy whisper. Loki stepped over the fallen Duke, his boot pressing into Dominic's shoulder, pinning him to the grate. He picked up the ledger of blood and held it over a vat of molten iron. A choice, your grace, Loki purred, his eyes reflecting the hellfire below. The book, and the names of every soul you own, or the girl. I drop the book and your empire vanishes. I take the girl and you live to breathe another day in your empty palace. Which is it? Dominic looked at the vat, then at Elsa. His stormy gray eyes were no longer cold. They were filled with a devastating, naked despair. He looked like a king who had realized his crown was made of lead. Take the book, Dominic whispered, his voice broken. Take the empire. Just let her go. Loki's smile widened into a jagged sneer. A duke who chooses a servant over a kingdom. How pathetic. With a flick of his wrist, Loki didn't drop the book. He threw it toward the far corner of the foundry where the fire was hottest. At the same moment he signaled his men. Seal the doors, Loki commanded. Let the fire finish them both. The syndicate vanished into the smoke, the heavy iron bolts of the foundry doors slamming shut with a final echoing thud. The room was a furnace. Thick, black smoke began to fill the rafters, choking the air. Elsa crawled toward Dominic, her vision swimming. He was slumped against a cooling pillar, his breathing shallow and rattling. Why? Elsa choked out, the smoke burning her throat. Why didn't you let him take me? You could have saved the ledger. You could have saved Bella's debt. Dominic reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her cheek. His fingers were searingly hot with fever. Because she's not collateral, Elsa. None of them are. I was using the ledger to track the families the previous Duke had ruined. I was buying their debts, to cancel them. I hadn't finished the paperwork for the Everdeens yet. I wanted to tell you, when we were safe. Elsa stared at him, the weight of the revelation hitting her harder than any blow. He hadn't been collecting souls. He had been trying to set them free in secret, trapped by the very system he inherited. Dominic, she whispered, using his name for the first time. I'm sorry, he gasped, his eyes fluttering shut. I'm so sorry I lied. I didn't want you to look at me with pity. I wanted you to look at me, the way you did that first night. The fire roared closer. A support beam groaned overhead, showering them in sparks. They were trapped in a tomb of iron and fire, the man she had learned to love dying in her arms, and the book that held the freedom of thousands turning to ash just a few yards away. Everything was lost. The silence of the Duke's table had finally swallowed them both. Elsa pulled his head into her lap, shielding his face from the heat with her cloak. She closed her eyes, the scent of smoke and the heat of his skin the last things she knew. Before we see if there's any hope left in the ashes, I have to ask, do you believe Dominic's confession? Is he truly a hero in disguise, or is this just another lie to find peace in his final moments? Tell us in the comments. And please, if you want to see if Elsa can find a way out of this nightmare, make sure you've subscribed to the channel. The roar of the fire was a physical weight, a wall of sound and heat that threatened to collapse the very soul of the iron foundry. Elsa Skywalker felt the blistering air sear her lungs, but her mind had never been clearer. She looked down at Dominic, his face pale beneath the soot, his eyes closed in a surrender he had never shown to any enemy. No, Elsa whispered, her voice cracking but firm. You don't get to die a martyr, Dominic Toretto Corleone. Not after you made me believe in the monster. You stay here and you watch me fix this. She remembered the weight in her pocket. The black diamond signet ring. It wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a key. She scrambled across the blistering metal floor, the heat melting the soles of her borrowed shoes. In the far corner, near the vat of molten iron, lay the ledger of blood. It wasn't ash, not yet. It had landed on a cooling vent, its leather cover smoldering but the pages still intact. As she reached for it, the ceiling groaned. A massive support beam, weakened by the intense heat, buckled. It swung down like a guillotine of fire, pinning the ledger beneath a jagged edge of steel. "Jack!" Elsa screamed over the roar. Jack Sparrow McFly appeared through the smog, coughing violently into his sleeve. He looked at the beam, then at the ledger, then at the fire licking at the edges of the room. "It's a lost cause, Elsa. The doors are barred from the outside. We have to find another way out before the roof drops. The ledger is the only way to save the families. To save Bella." Elsa shouted back. She grabbed a discarded iron lever and jammed it under the fallen beam. "Help me." Jack hesitated for a heartbeat, his survival instinct warring with the look in Elsa's eyes. A look that said she would burn to death before she let that book turn to cinders. With a curse, he grabbed the other side of the lever. They hauled upward. Their muscles screamed, the heat blistering their skin. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the beam shifted. Elsa lunged forward, snatching the ledger from the heat just as the beam slammed back down, sending a shower of sparks into the air. "Got it," she cried. But they were still trapped. The main doors were solid iron and the smoke was becoming a solid wall. Elsa ran back to Dominic's side. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open to see her clutching the scorched book to her chest. "You went back for it," he wheezed, a ghost of a smile touching his bloodied lips. "I went back for the truth," Elsa said. She looked at the signet ring on her finger. The black diamond wasn't just a stone, it was a seal. She looked at the wall behind the main furnace. There was an emblem etched into the stone, the same wolf's head as the ring. "Dominic, the ring. Is there a mechanism?" Dominic nodded weakly. "The Founder's escape. The wolf said." He pressed the ring into the iris. Elsa didn't waste a second. She dragged Dominic's heavy frame toward the wall while Jack provided a shoulder. She found the carving, a snarling wolf carved into the ancient granite of the foundry's foundation. She pressed the black diamond into the hollow of the eye. A mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. With a grinding of ancient gears, a section of the wall slid back, revealing a dark, cool passage that smelled of damp earth and freedom. "Go," Jack urged, pushing them toward the opening. As they tumbled into the darkness of the secret tunnel, the foundry floor behind them gave way, the vat of molten iron tipping over in a final, spectacular explosion of light and heat. The doors of their tomb were sealed by the very fire that was meant to kill them, but they were on the other side. In the cool quiet of the stone passage, Elsa laid Dominic down. The air was breathable here. She opened the ledger. There on the first page was a handwritten note in ink that had survived the heat. It wasn't a list of property. It was a list of manumission. Beside every name, including Bella's, was a stamped seal of "debt cancelled." Dominic reached out, his hand finding hers in the dark. I was going to announce it at the gala," he whispered. "The end of the Blackwood debts. I just needed the ledger to be public, so the council couldn't reverse it." Elsa felt a tear track through the soot on her cheek. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. "You're a fool, Dominic. A stubborn, arrogant, lonely fool." "And you," he gasped, his heart slowing to a steady rhythmic beat as the adrenaline faded, "are the only person who ever looked past the table." The turning point was complete. They had the book, they had their lives, and for the first time they had the truth. But the syndicate was still out there, and the Council of Lords would be waiting for a duke who didn't return. Before we head into the final confrontation where Elsa and Dominic must take back the city, I have to know. Do you think Elsa should ever go back to being a waitress, or is she the new power behind the Blackwood throne? Let us know in the comments. And hit that subscribe button. We're moments away from the grand finale. The Grand Belvedere Ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It had become a court of vultures. The Council of Lords, led by the opportunistic Cornelius Snow Harkness, stood in the center of the hall. Word of the foundry fire had spread like a plague. "The Duke is dead," Cornelius proclaimed, his voice echoing off the gilded molding. "The Blackwood line has ended in ash. We must divide the ledger's assets among the council to ensure the city's stability. Oakhaven cannot survive without a master." The doors to the ballroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a violence that shattered the nearest glass partition. Dominic Toretto Corleone walked in. He wasn't leaning on a cane. He wasn't coughing. He was draped in a fresh midnight blue military coat, his silver pistol holstered openly at his hip. Beside him, dressed in a gown of shimmering obsidian silk that looked like forged starlight, walked Elsa Skywalker. She wasn't carrying a tray. She was carrying the ledger of blood. The room went deathly silent. Cornelius turned ashen. "Your Grace, we heard. There was a fire." "There was a fire, Cornelius," Dominic said, his voice a low, terrifying growl that carried to every corner of the room. "And it burned away everything that was rotten in this city. Starting with the lie that this ledger belongs to you." Loki Odinson Vader stepped from the shadows behind the council, his hand on his blade. "You're a ghost, Dominic. A dying man playing dress-up. The Syndicate still has the city's throat in its grip." Elsa stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the gathered elite with a cold, piercing dignity. She didn't look like a waitress. She looked like a queen who had survived the underworld and brought back the sun. "The Syndicate has nothing," Elsa declared. She held the ledger high for all to see. "This book doesn't contain debts anymore. It contains the names of the citizens of Oakhaven. And as of this moment, every signature in this room, every debt, every collateral contract, is null and void. You have no authority." Cornelius shrieked. "You're a servant." "She is the executor of the Blackwood estate," Dominic countered, stepping to her side. He looked at the crowd, his stormy eyes burning with a new, terrifying clarity. "And she is the woman who saved my life while you were busy measuring my coffin. If any man here has an objection to her word, he answers to me." Loki lunged, his blade a silver streak aimed at Elsa's throat. He was fast, but Dominic was faster. He didn't use his gun. He caught Loki's wrist with a hand like a vice, the raw, primal strength of the Blackwood line returning in a surge of protective fury. With a sickening snap, he disarmed the enforcer and sent him sprawling across the floor. "Get out," Dominic whispered, a sound more frightening than a roar. "Before I decide that the fire in the foundry wasn't enough of a lesson." The Syndicate lookouts in the rafters, seeing their leader broken and the Duke standing tall, vanished into the night. The Council of Lords crumbled, scurrying toward the exits like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Dominic turned to Elsa. The adrenaline was fading and the pallor was returning to his cheeks, but his eyes were full of a light she had never seen before. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers in front of the entire remaining court. "The table is empty, Elsa," he whispered. "But for the first time I don't think I'll be dining alone." Elsa looked at the man who had been her monster, her mystery, and finally her partner. She leaned in, her voice a soft, triumphant hum. "The rules have changed, Dominic. From now on, the Duke doesn't sit at the head of the table. We sit together. Before we reach the heart-melting conclusion, I have to know, did you see that coming?" The Duke's grand entrance was everything. If you loved seeing Elsa take her power back, drop a yes in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed for the final chapter of this epic romance. The winter air of Oakhaven had changed. It no longer carried the sharp metallic tang of fear or the heavy soot of the lower city. Instead, as Elsa Skywalker stood on the balcony of the Blackwood estate, the wind tasted of pine and the distant, clean salt of the ocean. She wasn't wearing an apron. Her hands, once calloused from scrubbing floors and carrying heavy silver trays, were draped in soft velvet, but her grip remained as firm as ever. In her hand she held a final document, the deed to a cottage on the sun-drenched coast, signed and sealed in her name. "Is she ready?" a voice rumbled behind her. Elsa turned to see Dominic. He looked younger, the gray pallor of his skin replaced by a healthy bronze. The Iron Duke had found a new kind of strength, not the rigid, brittle power of a tyrant, but the flexible, enduring soul of a man who had something to live for. His sickness hadn't vanished, but with the best physicians in the kingdom and a heart that was no longer suffocating in isolation, he was winning the battle. "She's been ready for an hour," Elsa laughed, gesturing toward the courtyard below. There, sitting in a carriage pulled by 4 white horses, was Bella Swan Everdeen. The young girl was leaning out the window, her eyes wide with wonder as she watched the snowflakes dance in the air. She wasn't coughing. Her cheeks were pink with excitement, and she was clutching a brand new book of fairy tales, one where the heroines didn't wait to be rescued. "She thinks she's going to a palace," Elsa whispered, leaning her head against Dominic's shoulder. "She is," Dominic replied, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The coast house is hers. And the Blackwood Academy will be open by spring. No more children as collateral, Elsa. No more hidden ledgers. The transformation of Oakhaven had begun. The Duke's table was no longer avoided. It had been replaced by a long open hall where the citizens were invited to speak their minds. The wall of silence had been torn down, brick by brick, by a waitress who had been brave enough to ask a question. "You're staying for the inauguration of the new council?" Elsa asked, looking up into his stormy gray eyes. Dominic leaned down, his breath warm against her lips. "I'm staying wherever you are. The estate is just stone and mortar, Elsa. You are the only kingdom I care to rule." He kissed her then, a slow, deep connection that tasted of victory and 1,000 promised tomorrows. It wasn't the desperate kiss of the foundry or the guarded curiosity of the ballroom. It was a seal of a new era. As the carriage began to roll out of the gates, taking Bella toward a life of health and sunshine, Elsa looked out over the city. The lights of Oakhaven twinkled like fallen stars, no longer flickering in fear, but burning steady and bright. The waitress and the Duke. The mountain girl and the Iron King. They had started as a scandal and ended as a legend. And in the heart of the Blackwood estate, the most important rule was finally written in gold above the hearth. No one dines alone. What an incredible journey. From a silent, terrifying table to a love that rewrote the laws of a kingdom. I am so moved by Elsa's courage and Dominic's redemption. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment letting us know your favorite moment. Was it the Foundry escape or the Duke's grand return? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next emotional adventure. We have so many more stories of love, mystery, and triumph waiting for you. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply pull up a chair.